A gute Woche and a guten Chodesh, everyone. Tonight's shir is Lilu Nishmas, my dear father, Olav Shalom, whose first Yortzeit will be tomorrow night. The Rebbe soll gesund sein began the Farbrengen today that today is Shabbos Shkolim, which means, based on what Mishnah tells us and Gemara tells us, that when it comes the beginning of Adar, or the Shabbos before Adar, the Mishnah uses the expression Be'echad ba'Adar mashmiin al hashkolim. As soon as we approach Adar, that is when we proclaim a fund for Shkolim. Now this was done in the days of the Beis HaMikdash, when every Yid would contribute a machzis hashekel, a half of a shekel, and the funds which were accumulated in the Beis HaMikdash would go for korbanos. And based on this custom, even today that we unfortunately do not have the Beis HaMikdash, however, there is a minig Yisrael that on the Shabbos before the month of Adar, or the Shabbos of Rosh Chodesh Adar should fall out to be on a Shabbos. That Shabbos, besides reading the regular Kriya in the Torah, we also read a Kriya in the Torah, an additional laning in the Torah, which is in Parshas Kisisa, and that is regarding the contributing of the Machzis HaShekel, which was given by every Yid. And today is Shabbos Parshas Shkol. And as the Rebbe added on, immediately when he began talking about the Indian of Shkolim, that he's confident that everyone learns the halachas and looks up the halachas, the source of all these inyanim, because every Yid is becheskas kashrus. We assume that everybody does his responsibility. And Memele, the Rebbe says, based on that, everybody in the remainder of time which will be left, everybody will also undoubtedly look up all of these inyanim regarding Parsha Shkol. Parsha Shkolim comes at the beginning as an introduction to Adar. In fact, the way we have it this year, we go straight from Shabbos into Rosh Chodesh. And this is expressed even in Shabbos. We do things that show that tomorrow will be Rosh Chodesh. Number one, we do it in the Haftarah. Besides reciting the regular Haftarah, which has to do with Parsha Shkolim, we add on in the Haftarah 2 psukim regarding Macha Chodesh. And also later in the day, when it will come to Mincha, we do not say Tzidkascha Tzedek in today's Mincha. Why? Because tonight is Rosh Chodesh. So it is already today that the Rosh Chodesh is felt. What is the specialty in the month of Adar? So regarding the month of Adar, what is the main inyan in Adar? The main inyan in Adar is the Yontef of Purim. It is brought in Svarim. When Svarim explain the difference between Chanukah and Purim, they are both Yomim Tovim Midarabanan, though there is a primary difference, a major difference between the two of them. What is it? Chanukah is a spiritual nitzachon. In other words, what did the Yevanim want? The Yevanim wanted to affect the Yidden spiritually. And we succeeded by the fact that whatever they wanted, whatever their intention was, did not work out. As we recite in the Va'ala Nisim of Chanukah, what did they want? Lahavira mechuke ritzeinecha. They wanted to take away the Yidden from observing mitzvahs. Lahashkicham teiresecha. They wanted the Yidden should forget Torah. So what they actually, their aim was, what they were targeting at, was to create a boundary, chas v'shalom, between the Yidden and the Eibishter. They wanted to see to it, their intention was that Yidden should not be affiliated and committed to Torah. Purim, it was completely different. What did they want on Purim? What did Haman want on Purim? Haman wanted to harm the Yidden physically, chas v'shalom. He wanted to hurt Yidden physically, begashmias, in their bodies. And that is why we will notice that though the introduction to the Ba'ala Nisim Seifa Chanukah and Seifa Purim is the same. Ala Nisim, Ala Purim, Ala Gvuros, that we say the same, Sai Chanukah and Sai Purim. However, the text of each of the Ala Nisims is a different one, because it was a totally different thing what Haman wanted to do, as opposed to what the Yevonim wanted to do by the Yontif of Chanukah. Now that we celebrate Purim, it is not only an Inyan that has a shaykhus to that single day, but Purim has a shaykhus to the entire month. The entire month, as the expression in the Megillah is, the entire month was converted from a month of sadness to a month of joy. And Mela, now that we are about to enter this month, what is the specialty of the month of Adar? The specialty of the month of Adar is the whole inyan of the importance of serving the Rebishter through Gashmias, serving the Rebishter through the Guf. And that is today's Sedra also the same. What is the big today's Sedra? Today's Sedra is Pashas Mishpatim. What is the contents of the entire Sedra? The entire Sedra deals with most of the inyanim which are discussed in today's Sedra are inyanim that have a shaykhus to Gashmias, material inyanim. How a Yid is supposed to go about in all of these inyanim. So what is the hayra, the lesson from all of this? The importance of a Yid serving the Rebishter through Gashmis Tikinyonim, through his Guf. And here we come to the Alter Rebbe in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe in Tanya in Perik Chavav explains the importance of serving the Rebishter through Simcha, through joy. And there the Alter Rebbe expresses himself, Kenoida lakoil, as it is known to everyone, Pirush HaArizal, the interpretation of the Arizal, on the Pasek of Tachas Asher Lo Yavadeta Es Hashem Elokecha B'Simcha V'Tov Lavav. Which means, there's a Pasek in the Torah tells us that Yidden will be punished for not, what's the Pashat of Pshat of the Pasek? For not serving the Rebishter at a time when you were B'Simcha V'Tov Lavav. In other words, you were in a mood of joy. You had whatever you needed, and still you did not Chas v'Shalom serve the Rebishter. That's the Pashat of Pshat. The Arizal Taich is different. The Arizal Taich is that the Rebishter Chas v'Shalom punishes for not serving him b'simcha. It's not enough that we fulfill the wish of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is insufficient. We have to fulfill the wish of Hashem with a tremendous expression of joy. And this is what the Pasuk tells us. Tachas Asher Lo Yavadetos Hashem Elokecha B'Simcha V'Tov Lavav. For not fulfilling the wish of Hashem B'Simcha V'Tov Lavav. V'Tov Lavav means a good heart, with a joyous heart. Merely for not doing that, Chas v'Shalom, the Rebishter punishes. In other words, the Rebishter wants, the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that we have to fulfill his mitzvahs B'Simcha. A Yid has to serve the Rebishter with happiness. When the Alter Rebbe quotes this Arizal, the Alter Rebbe adds on two words, Kenoida lakoil, as it is known to everyone. Is it known to everyone, this interpretation of the Arizal, the Rebbe asks? There are some people who are far from knowing this interpretation of the Arizal, and don't know of his entire commentary. And we know the greatness of the Arizal, for those who know his greatness. But there are many, many Yidden who don't. And here the Alter Rebbe expresses himself, Kenoida lakoil. It's an established fact. It's known to everyone. In other words, everybody who you only approach, you'll ask him, what does the Arizal teach on the pasuk of Tachas Asher Lo Yavadetos Hashem Elokecha B'Simcha V'Tov Lavav? You can be sure that he will know the answer. What in the interpretation of the Arizal? So the Rebbe is teaching that the intention of the Alter Rebbe is, we find in Tanakh, by Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, we find that there were certain things which the Navi tells us that Daniel saw. However, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah did not. And even though they didn't see it, still Navi tells us that their bodies began shivering, their bodies began trembling. So the Gemara uses the expression, Afal Gav, the Ihu Loi Chozi, even though they themselves cannot see it. They didn't see. Daniel saw, and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah didn't. However, the Gemara continues, Mazlaihu Chozi. We know every person has a mazel. their mazel, vitzi, things which they didn't, and that's why, the Gemara continues, it had such an effect on them that it had even a gashmiistic effect on their bodies, that their bodies began shivering. The same the Rebbe is teaching. Naturally, not everybody knows, it has not reached everyone, the interpretation of the Arizal regarding the importance of serving the Rebishter with simcha. However, the Alter Rebbe is saying, Kenoida la koil, as it is known to everyone, meaning the Alter Rebbe is out by this, he's creating an established fact. It has to be that every Yid has to serve the Rebishter with simcha. And this is something which a Yid who serves the Rebishter has to have this kind of feeling within him as well. He has to realize that what is the proper way to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the proper way to serve him is metoich simcha, from a mood of happiness. And naturally, even though he is not aware of the interpretation of the Arizal, still it is there in the sense like Mazlayu Chazda, just like we find by Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they didn't see anything, and though it had an effect on them because their Mazel saw it. The same the Rebbe is teaching. This is something which the Alter Rebbe is instilling into every Yid by relating this Pirush of the Arizal and stressing Kenoida la koil, that this is something which should be known to everyone, and take people that don't know it. However, even though they don't know it as an interpretation of the Arizal regarding the concept of serving the Rebishter in a mood of happiness, but at the same time this concept is existing within them, not even knowing that the Arizal teaches that. But when a Yid winds himself up to serve the Rebishter properly, he's also going to get this feeling that what is considered properly serving the Rebishter is the one who serves him mitoich simcha, from happiness. I'm talking about the importance of guf and gashmius, how we serve the Rebishter through inyanim gashmiim, and the Rebbe here brought how it's explained in Chassidus that the entire Torah was given so that we can serve the Rebishter through Gashmias. Otherwise, Ruchnius was before Matan Torah as well. What was the accomplishment of Matan Torah? That we can serve the Rebishter through Gashmias. The Rebbe brought the famous Gemara that there was a discussion Lamaila. Mother says that in Gan Eden there was a discussion regarding a halacha. This is explained at length in Likutei Torah from the Alter Rebbe. There's a maimah based on this. Regarding a halacha, in the halachas of tumah v'tar, and the halachas of purity and impure. And the Gemara there tells us, man noichach, the discussion was going on b'mesifta de Rakia, in the yeshiva of Rakia, the heavenly yeshiva. And there the Gemara says, man noichach, who was present? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Bar Nachmani was present. Rabbi from the Gemara, who was living on this world, and he was present Lamaila when they had this discussion. And then the Gemara concludes that the Rabbi gave his opinion, and when he gave his opinion, that is immediately thereafter he passed away. He passed away from this world and went to the Olam Emes. So the Alter Rebbe explains in Likutei Torah, why did they have to come on to an opinion of Rabbi? Because once the Rebishter gave the Torah to Yidden, the authority on Torah is here by Yidden Lamata. So the fact that they had a dispute b'mesifta de Rakia, in the heavenly yeshiva, regarding this specific halacha, whether it is Toher or Tomei, this couldn't have had, in other words, there is no one in Mesifta de Rakia that can have any decision in Torah once Torah was given to Yidden Lamata. Once Torah, the Rebishter gave Torah to Yidden here on this world, it is the Bezdin on this world who has the final say regarding any union in Torah. And that is why who is the one that had to make the psak regarding that shaila? It was Rabbi Bar Nachmani, who still had a shaykhus to this world. In fact, there the Alter Rebbe raises in Likutei Torah the question, the fact that Rabbi Bar Nachmani gave this psak as he was passing away, so is it considered that he still has a shaykhus to this world, or is it already considered that he has a shaykhus to the world to come? But regardless, what the Rebbe was explaining based on all of these inyanim is the importance of serving the Rebishter through Gashmias, through Guf, and this is
what this entire month is all about, and how serving the Rebishter through Gashmias has to be done with a tremendous amount of simcha, which this is what the Alter Rebbe is demanding from us, especially by adding on the words K'noida Lakoil. It is an established fact, it is known to everybody. And by adding on these words, the Alter Rebbe has kind of given everybody access to be able to have access to this tremendous amount of simcha and be able to serve the Rebishter mit simcha. Then in the second Sikha, Rebbe began the second Sikha, which he had a doubt at the beginning of the Farbrengen. What should he really discuss first? Should he really relate first the inyan which we just spoke about, the first Sikha, or should he talk about what he's going to talk about in the second Sikha first? Why? In the second Sikha, the Rebbe discussed an inyan. He says this is something which has to do with V'hiyisim Nikiyim Mahashem Yisrael. It's an posik. When something happens, there's the obligation of every person to be inoki, to be clean. Mahashem Yisrael. In other words, when somebody is in a position where he may be suspected of something, so it is his obligation, as the expression in Yiddish is, to faren für sich, to explain himself la Hashem and to Yisrael. This is the inyan which the Rebbe is going to talk about. However, the previous inyan which was discussed, this is an inyan which is always the custom at the Farbrengen, to be a Pesach bidvar malchus, to start something with a saying over an inyan in Torah. The Rebbe says he was debating what has a preference over what. But he decided he will do like he always does, and begin with an inyan in Torah, which this was discussed in the first Sikha. And later in the second Sikha, he will go to an inyan which he feels he has to talk about, because, as just mentioned, it has to do with the V'yisim Nekiyim Ma'ashem Yisrael. Rebbe says normally it is not his inyan to get involved in an inyan that has a shaykhus to Rabbanim. And however, here again it's an exception. And though Rabbanim, it is their obligation and their responsibility to see that everything functions properly, this is the inyan of a Rav. And here the Rebbe said that in our community we are fortunate to have a setup of Rabbanim which is not many communities have this arrangement, and the explanation is a very simple one. Because we have Rabbanim, the Rebbe says, that were elected by everyone in the community. Normally, when a rabbi is chosen, it is a committee that selects the rabbi, and later he remains on his position, and ultimately he's approved by everybody in the congregation that they want him as their Rav. In our situation, the Rebbe says, the situation of Crown Heights is such which we cannot compare it to most other communities in New York, because here there was an election of all of the Rabbanim, which means that everybody who only took part in the election, everybody that voted, all the residents, all the community residents here voted. Memele, this Rabbanis is a much stronger Rabbanis than a Rabbanis in other communities. And here the Rebbe quoted an expression of Rishonim that we have to view our Rabbanim, and the expression is, it's an expression in a Rishon, as an Abir Sheba Abirim, which means the strongest of the strongest. In other words, we have to have the fullest respect, and it is in their power to run the community, and we have to look up to all their psukim and so forth. And the Rebbe says that something has occurred, and it happened in his shul, and that is why, and he was present at the time, and that is why he feels that it is his obligation to speak up about it. And it happened a week ago. It happened last Shabbos. Rebbe says he himself was also called up to an aliyah last Shabbos. However, the previous aliyahs, last week the Aseres HaDibros were read. And to the aliyah of the Aseres HaDibros, it would have been suitable to call one of the Rabbanim and none of the Rabbanim will call to that Aliyah. The Rebbe says some may think, is it a Lubavitcher minig that a Rav must be called to the Aliyah of the Aseres HaDibros? Or is it mentioned in Hayom Yom or in Sefer HaMenhagim, which these are the Svarim that mention Lubavitcher Menhagim, and there it is not mentioned. So why is he making an issue of it that the Rabbanim, one of the Rabbanim did not get the Aliyah? So the Rebbe says the reason for it is, and he will explain, there is an expression in Gemara, Arkise de Misane. Arkise de Misane is an expression in Gemara in Avodah Zarah. It applies, normally we know that there are 3 mitzvahs which a Yid is supposed to bizich moiser nefesh on, sacrifice his life on. Regarding all other mitzvahs, he's not obligated to sacrifice his life on. Mitzvahs are Gila Aroyes, Avodah Zarah, and Shvichas Dam. Not to kill anybody, or serving Avodah Zarah, or any Indian of Gilu Aroyes. Translated, Gesundheit.
Incest.
Forbidden relationships, right. However, the Gemara says, if it's a time of a Gezeira, when the Goyim come up with a Gezeira, that they want that the Yidden should tie their shoes in a certain way, that's what the Gemara uses. Arkis de Mesane, the shoelaces have to be tied in a certain way, and this is how the Goyim are pressuring Yidden, and by tying shoes that way he will be identified as a Yid. Then the Gemara gets into a question that Arkis de Mesane, if it's a Shas Gzeir, in other words it's a very sensitive time for Yidden, then Arkis de Mesane, which is merely tying the shoelaces, is something which a person has to take into deep consideration, how he has to react at a sensitive time. And it may be a question that even Arkis de Mesane also requires Yehareg Val Yaver. The same the Rebbe says, Rebbe compared it, in other words, the Rebbe says that being that there were some individuals, as it was brought to his attention that in the beginning, initially, were not satisfied with the fact of electing Rabbanim, they were fighting against it and so forth. So, therefore the Rebbe says, here it was an opportune time that the Aliyah of the Aseres HaDibros should have been given to one of the Rabbanim. The Rebbe says he's speaking out about this very freely. The Rebbe helped him that he's in the position that he does not have to come on to anybody, and therefore he can fully fulfill what the Torah says, Leisoguru mepnei ish, not to be afraid of anyone. And therefore he's speaking out very, very clearly about something that happened, which the Rebbe continued that he feels that this is against the Shulchan Aruch, and therefore he feels that mechila, proper forgiveness, has to be asked, as the halachas are in the Shulchan Aruch. Here the Rebbe mentioned that there is a halacha in Shulchan Aruch, and the Rambam elaborates on it, that the Talmud Chacham, Mother says, Kol Talmud Chacham she'einu noikim v'noita kanocha, the Talmud Chacham has to have an amount of firmness within him as well. And if he doesn't have it, the Gemara says, he's not a Talmud Chacham. Then the Gemara also continues that if one was insulted, Mother says that the great inyan of one who is a shemeacher posoi, he hears himself being insulted and he doesn't respond. Shoymim cherposan ve'einon oinin, they don't respond. However, the Rebbe says he would not think that this can be compared to this particular case, though the Rabbanim may want to use an approach of modesty. However, when it's negei kavod haTorah, it's an Indian of protecting Torah and protecting the community, then the Rebbe says he doesn't think, as we see it clear in the Rambam, that they should apply the Indian of Anivas. Rebbe elaborated in explaining in general what is a Rav. A Rav is not sufficient that a person who has smicha, and yoyre, and yodin, and knows how to learn, he is still not considered a Rav. A Rav must have shimush, must have practice by other Rabbanim. and otherwise he's not considered a Rav. There's an expression in Gemara about somebody who helped his Rav carry his packages to the Beis HaMerchetz when he went to the bath, to a bathing place. The Rebbe says what he means by shimush is not carrying a Rav's packages when he's going to a bathing, to a mikveh, to a merchetz. The Indian of shimush is something which, without shimush, without properly being around Rabbonim who paskin shaylas, one does not have the proper. Then he himself is not authorized to paskin shaylas, and therefore, when we're talking about our Rabbonim in our community, it is not only people that have yoyre and yodin, which is the proper smicha, and have it not only from one Rav, but have it from many Rabbonim. It is much more than that. They have shimush, and memela they can be the proper Rabbonim. And here something like this happened. The Rebbe criticized it, condemned it very, very strong. And the Rebbe says he's gotten various excuses, that being that there are 3 Rabbonim and one of them is a Levi. So says he's well aware that one is a Levi, but there are 3 Rabbonim. And amongst 3 Rabbonim there are 2 others that could have gotten the Aliyah. Then the Rebbe says he's gotten excuses that they weren't present at the time when the laning took place in 770. So the Rebbe says it's the obligation of the Gabbai, just like he is responsible to see to it that there's a Sefer Torah where to read from. It is his responsibility that the proper people to call up to the Torah are also present by Kriyas HaTorah. And at the same time, however, Rebbe stressed that those who are interested in causing him a feeling of satisfaction, it is not by getting involved and repeating these type of inyanim and then trying to figure out whom did he mean and what did he mean. And Bechal, he said he's not bashful. When he means something and he wants somebody to get a message, he speaks out very, very clear. And his message reaches to whoever he wants it to reach. And on the other hand, he says, when people get involved and get carried away with when he talks these type of things and start thinking whom did he mean and what was meant and start putting in words which he didn't say and make all types of calculations, this is something which is totally against his will. And he expressed himself, he's asering that this should be done, and even used the expression that whoever does do such type of things, it is like they are having milchama, they are having a battle with him. The Rebbe says there are those that have battles with him. What could he do? They sleep very peacefully, and he himself, Baruch Hashem, also sleeps very peacefully. But on the other hand, he says, let it be known that this is not his wish, that people should be involved in other words, have a koch, have an enjoyment, and these when he's forced to talk such type of an inyan, and then start taking it apart. What did he mean by saying this word, or did he mean something else by saying another word, and so forth. And again, those that are out to cause him satisfaction, the best inyan is by bringing people together, by creating achdus and hiskarvus and kirov amongst people. This is basically the teichen of the second sikha. It's customary in the Farbrengens that came out to mention that whenever something takes place, whether it is Siyum Rambam or a dedication of a Chabad house or any other type of Siyum, mashke is given into the Rebbe, or a Malav Malke or a specific dinner. Mashke is given into the Rebbe before Shabbos, and during the Shabbos Farbrengen, the particular individual who represents this particular institution goes over to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe gives them the bottle of mashke of the Rebbe, as the Rebbe usually stresses that part of the mashke should be distributed, at least a small part, during the Farbrengen because of Shabbos. Otherwise, it is considered that we are preparing we're doing something on Shabbos to prepare for something which will take place during the week. And the remainder should be distributed at a specific occasion. Today, one of the people that gave in mashke was Reb Shimon Goldman, because of tonight that there is a Malav Malke of his Gemilas Chesed fund, the Gemilas Chesed Shemri Shabbos. As it's customary in previous years, that it used to be the same custom by his father-in-law, Rabbi Yochanan Gordon, Olav Shalom, that when they go over to the Rebbe with mashke, the Rebbe asks them to tell a story, to put on a shtreimel and tell a story. And so he did today. And he told the story of Rab Nochem Chernobyl.
Story of and he related this story in the presence of the Rebbe and everyone during the Farbrengen. That Reb Nachum Shenobela had a specific city where he used to travel to once a year. And every time he came to the city, he would stay in the house of a specific person. Once, before Reb Nachum came to that city, Reb Nachum notified the individual that he will not stay at his house. Not only that, but he's forbidding this person to come to any of the tishon, to any of the like Farbrengens which Reb Nachum will have. He should not be present at any of the davenings which Reb Nachum will be present while he will spend in that town, unless this individual comes up with a contribution of 2,000 rubles for the charity fund of Reb Nachum. The Yid got this message. Could imagine what the Yid felt like. He was a poor Yid, didn't have the first ruble to put down on the table to accumulate the 2,000. So he and his wife immediately decided they will sell whatever they possess so that they could put together the amount of the 2,000 rubles. It seems like they were unsuccessful. They didn't even get half of the amount. They were barely able to put together, after selling whatever they had, all pieces of jewelry and anything else of any kind of value which they owned, and they merely put together 700 rubles. Reb Nachum Shenobel arrived in town and did not go to the house of this Yid, and again sent a message to this Yid that he does not want him to come to any of the tefillos or to any of the tishon, which is like when Reb Nachum is heading a tish, a Hasidische Farbrengen. He does not want this Yid to be present. Reb Nachum spent a while in town. Obviously was there for a few days or a week. And then he sent an additional message to this Jew. He sent him a message that when the entire town will go and express farewell to Reb Nachum and walk him to the end of the town, this Yid shouldn't even be present there. So we can imagine what this person felt like. He was such a close chassid to Reb Nachum, and here Reb Nachum comes to town and comes out with such a decree. We can imagine how hurt this individual was. Period of time passes, and in those days there were soldiers, government soldiers that would be traveling from town to town, and a group of soldiers arrived into the city. Custom in those days was that every few soldiers would be assigned to another home where they would stay. And naturally the Jewish homes in town were amongst it. Amongst the group of soldiers as they were traveling, there was always the group of the soldiers, the few of the soldiers who had with them the bag of the treasury. In other words, they had all the expenses which they took along with them for these trips as they were going from city to city. And in this particular Yid's house, where Reb Nachum used to stay, there were also a few soldiers put up to stay in his house. The group of soldiers received a sudden command that they have to leave town suddenly, earlier than their schedule was. So, in a mood of rush and haste, so those few soldiers who had the treasury bag with them forgot it. Where did they forget it? Those soldiers stood in the house of Reb Nachum's chassid, and they forgot it and left it in the home of that chassid. After they traveled a bit out of the city, it dawned on them that they left a bag with thousands and thousands of rubles in it. So they went back to the city to search. So they won't go from one house to another house. They were strangers in the city, so they really couldn't identify the house which they were in. So they looked in the house before Reb Nachum's, and they looked in the house behind Reb Nachum's, and they looked in the house after Reb Nachum's. Reb Nachum's chassid. But the Hashgacha Pratis led that it did not dawn on them to recognize that they stood in the house of Reb Nachum's chassid and to go in and make a search there. After they left, and a short period of time passed,
The chassid walks over to the bag, and full with a feeling of joy, the first thing that he does is he counts out 2,000 rubles. Before he does anything else, leaves the rest of the bag, gets onto a wagon and travels to his Rebbe Reb Nochem. Travels to his Rebbe Reb Nochem to give him the 2,000 rubles. The Rebbe sees him, so the Rebbe says, listen, I'm going to explain to you why I acted so strange a while ago when I visited your city. And he tells him, you should know, I saw in heaven that you are going to be awarded with riches. The only thing that was lacking, you did not demand it. You did not ask for it. And you have to ask for it very, very strong. And when you ask for it and you demand it very strong, then the Rebbe gives. So that's why I put you up into such a position where you were in dire need, searching for 2,000 rubles. If I wouldn't have put you into such a position, you would never look for it, or it never bothered you. So years would have passed and you would have never asked the Rebbe for it. But when you realized that I'm requesting and I'm demanding the 2,000 rubles, so you had no alternative, and you began demanding from the Rebbe, you began asking from Hashem that the Rebbe should bless you with wealth. And here it is, it was fulfilled. This story Reb Shimon Goldman related this afternoon in the Farbrengen. After he finished telling the story, the Rebbe has an expression when he has a very strong question in a Rashi. He uses the expression, it's a klotz kasha, it's a firm question. The Rebbe says he has a very firm question on this story.
Obvious person.
And the Rebbe says the story is a very nice one. The beginning of the story is nice, and the end of the story is nice. However, the Frierdiker Rebbe has taught us that when we relate a story, we have to relate it with its fullest accuracy. Because sometimes, if we don't, there are certain points in a story when they're not related accurately that ruin the entire story. The same the Rebbe says is in this particular situation. Reb Nachem Chernobyl was known as a tzaddik, outstanding tzaddik. Reb Nachem arrived into a city, and you want to tell me that Reb Nachem was in a city and was torturing, kind of like torturing this individual for all the days that he spent in the city, and that person should be sitting at home and shedding tears, the Rebbe used the expression, shedding chassidish tears, for the fact that he can't get close to his Rebbe. It's hard to believe that this is how Reb Nachem acted. Especially we know the greatness of Reb Nachem's answering Amen Yehi Shmei Rabba. There's a story related that Reb Nachem was overweight. And the reason for it is, not from eating, he had such a joy responding to Amen Yehi Shmei Rabba that the joy of answering Amen Yehi Shmei Rabba gave him satisfaction that he became fat because of that. So we're talking about such an individual. So Reb Nachem is going to see to it that a chassid who he knew the closeness of this chassid, and he's going to say that for an entire period of time that he is in the city, that chassid can't come into his midst, and that chassid is not even allowed to bid farewell when the entire Stadt, when the entire city is gesegnet and sich is saying goodbye to Reb Nachem. Obviously the Rebbe says the contents of the story is true. The only thing is, the message of Reb Nachem must have been that for the first day, or perhaps for the first tefillah, for the first davening, which Reb Nachem will daven in town, that person would be prohibited to come. However, it's hard to believe that from additional Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbos to answer together with Reb Nachem, as just mentioned how dear Amen Yehi Shmei Rabba is to Reb Nachem, Reb Nachem will hold back a Yid from coming to him. So the Rebbe concluded, the beginning of the story is true, the end of the story is true. However, the fact in the middle, that Reb Nachem spent a long time in the city, and the entire time he didn't let the individual come into any of his davenings, or to any of his tish, or even to come say goodbye, this the Rebbe says is probably not so, And it is just that Reb Nachum was able to, because Reb Nachum was able to arouse Agmas Nefesh. In other words, he was able to arouse that this person should feel bad, that he can't come close to Reb Nachum, even by not allowing him to come for one tefillah, for one davening, and that would have aroused, broken that person more than enough that he should feel bad that he can't be together with Reb Nachum. Rebbe concluded that he hopes by him criticizing the story that it will have no effect on tonight's Melave Malka. On the contrary, everybody should go to the Melave Malka and contribute nicely. He says because to take care of his fee, the Rebbe says that he removed such a strong kasha on this story. Therefore, he hopes. The Rebbe says that the person who told the story is definitely forgiving him. He's asking publicly mechila, slicha, forgiveness from this individual, from Reb Shimon Goldman who told the story. Rebbe says, and that everybody should answer. Rebbe expressed himself that everybody should answer Amen on his asking for the forgiveness, and again that everybody should take part in the Melave Malka and contribute nicely towards this fund. And he just meant that the story should come out clearly as the story should sound. The Rebbe continued in the Farbrengen, as we mentioned earlier, that today is Shabbos Parsha Shkolin. What is the inyan of Parsha Shkolin? That every Jew contributed a machzis ha-shekel, a half of a shekel. And by them contributing the half of the shekel, these funds went for the Mishkan. Rebbe says, for Kabbanis Sibur, and initially, while being in the Mishkan, it went for the Adonim. What do we see from this? We see a remarkable thought in all this. Sockets which were put as a fund, which was something fundamental to erect the Mishkan on. We see a tremendous thing here, the Rebbe says. What do we see here? The importance of Avas Yisrael, the importance of Achdus Yisrael. How? A Yid himself is only a half. He's giving a half of a shekel. It is only when two Yidden unite that they become a whole, and it becomes one shekel, which is a contribution for the Mishkan or for the Beis HaMikdash. The Rebbe elaborated on this thought and brought it out. That interesting, we see, normally we know tzedakah. The Alter Rebbe explains the greatness of tzedakah. And when he explains the importance of tzedakah, the Alter Rebbe adds on that a Yid has an opportunity to give tzedakah many times. In small sums, it is something which is very desirable. Why? Because each time he's fulfilling the mitzvah of tzedakah. And tzedakah has to be given with a zrizas, with a rush. He has to rush to give the tzedakah. He shouldn't take his time. Just like we see by Avraham Avinu, when Avraham Avinu took his son Yitzchak on the Akedah. The Alter Rebbe explains in the Igeras HaKodesh, the fact that Avraham was ready to sacrifice his son, we find many Yidden that went on Kiddush Hashem. We don't have to be an Avraham or Yitzchak for that. However, the specialty by Avraham and Yitzchak was the zrizos, how Avraham and Yitzchak both ran with a happiness to fulfill the wish of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The same the Rebbe says when we are giving tzedakah. When a Yid takes upon himself a contribution to donate to tzedakah, he takes a sum upon himself. He doesn't have to give the entire sum at once. He can give it in pieces. Famous Gemara, if one says he's giving this selah, this amount of to tzedakah on the condition that his son stays alive, and his son is chas v'shalom sick, the Gemara says it's a remarkable tzedakah. Harei tzaddik gomer, the Gemara uses the expression, the person who gives tzedakah on a condition. But when he contributes this selah, he doesn't have to give it all at once. A selah is a sum of money, days of Gemara. He doesn't have to give it all at once. He can give it piece by piece. Machzis HaShekel is an exception. A Yid can't come every second day or every third day to the treasurer in the Beis HaMikdash and give him a few prutes, and then ultimately he will come to the Machzas HaShekel. The halacha in Machzas HaShekel is that it has to be given at once. And here in the moral of it, we understand it. Why? Because the idea of Machzas HaShekel is to stress the importance of every Yid. A Yid in his own rights, himself, is not a complete, he's only a half. So that's why he can't give a third of a shekel, he can't give a quarter of a shekel. Because he can't give 10% of a shekel, he has to give a half a shekel. And by him giving a half a shekel, and another Yid giving a half a shekel, here the two Yidden are united, and here we see the great inyan of Avas Yisrael and Achdus Yisrael. Talking about the contributions for the Mishkan, the Rebbe came into another inyan. Rebbe explained, we know that there are certain mitzvahs which a Yid fulfilled in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, and there are some mitzvahs which we do not have now, because we only had them in the times of the Beis HaMikdash. In fact, if we were to take account of the 613 mitzvahs, we will see that we are left now with the minority of the mitzvahs. The majority number of mitzvahs we unfortunately cannot fulfill now. Why? Because we're in Golus, we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, we're not in Eretz Yisrael like in the times when we had the Beis HaMikdash. On the other hand, we know that there's a pasuk, Tamim tiyeim Hashem Elokecha, a Yid should be whole and complete with the Rebishter. So Chazal tell us based on this pasuk that we have 613 mitzvahs, and against the 613 mitzvahs there are 613 parts in a person's body. There's Eivarim and Gidim, 248 for the mitzvahs asay, 365 corresponding to the 365 leis asay. Who says, could we say that now that we are lacking the fulfillment of these mitzvahs, that we are lacking something in our bodies because we are lacking the fulfillment of the mitzvahs? Not rational to say so. So, what is the interpretation? The interpretation is that we have these mitzvahs in the spiritual sense. As we all know regarding davening, that davening replaces kabbalah. So the fact, the Rebbe says, expressed himself, that a Nebuchadnezzar or a Titus, Rishayim, who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, because of them we should be lacking in our bodies today? We can't say that. So we must come to this interpretation that we have an opportunity to fulfill the mitzvahs spiritually. In fact, the Rebbe, in the Sikha which is printed this week, in the Sikha of Mishpatim, based on this week's Sedre, which is also discussed in this week's Sedre, the four various categories of Shemrim, of watchmen. So there's a Shalah HaKodesh, which is mentioned in the Sikha. Shalah HaKodesh explains that we have these four categories in the spiritual sense. Not only is it dealing when one gives an object to another person to guard for him, and it's a question whether he compensates him or he doesn't compensate him, which means a Shem Achinam or a Shem Asecha. We have these things in the spiritual sense as well. So Memela, we have the whole idea of Beis HaMikdash in its spiritual sense. What is the inyan of Beis HaMikdash? The inyan of Beis HaMikdash, in fact, this is what we are reading about in this week's Sedra, in other words, which we began reading today to Mincha Pashas Truma. There we read the pasuk, V'asuli Mishkan v'shachanti b'seicha. The Rebbe says, make me a dwelling place, and I will rest amongst them. So we all know the famous Chazal, B'soichoi lo nemar ela b'soichom. It is not mentioned in I will rest in it, but I will rest amongst them, meaning B'soich kol echad ve'echad. So this leads us to learn that there is a Mishkan, a Beis HaMikdash within each and every Jew. A spiritual Beis HaMikdash. And the spiritual Beis HaMikdash within each and every one of us is very similar to the Beis HaMikdash, to the Gashmistic Beis HaMikdash. And here the Rebbe says this comes in continuation to what he has written about recently. There are two letters that came out from the Rebbe, both dated between Yud and Tesvav Shvat. Both outstanding dates, the day of Yud Shvat and the day of Tu B'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah Leilanis. And the Rebbe wrote two general letters, one addressed to adults and one addressed to children. And in both of these letters the Rebbe stresses the inyan of a Beis Chabad,
similar to what we're just talking about, that every Yid, it is the obligation of every person, adults, children, everyone, to create in their homes, amongst their midst, within our homes, a bias which should excel in Torah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah. And this is what the Beis HaMikdash was. The Beis HaMikdash was Avodah, we know, Korbanos, and now we have Tefillah, which replaces Korbanos. The Beis HaMikdash is outstanding in Torah. As the Rebbe quoted the Ramban. The Ramban tells us that the most important thing in the Beis HaMikdash was the Orein. What was in the Orein? The Luchos, Torah. So we know, here we see how Torah had a very obvious shaykhs to the Beis HaMikdash. In fact, we know that there was the Lishkas Hagozis, there was a special area in the Beis HaMikdash, which was assigned for the Sanhedrin, which is again, shows us an association of Torah and the Beis HaMikdash. Then there's a Gemara. The Gemara tells us, Haroitze lehashir yatzpin, which means, the Gemara refers to the Shulchan. In the Beis HaMikdash there was a Shulchan, there was a table. And that table was set in the north side of the Beis HaMikdash. And what was on the table? On the table was bread. What does bread represent? This represents the union of tzedakah. Gashmi is the tzedakah, to help a person. So in the Beis HaMikdash, all of these three inyanim were the fundamental things of the Beis HaMikdash. The same the Rebbe says, now when we are doing preparing our homes, that they should be suitable for the V'shachanti b'seicham, that the Rebbe should dwell amongst us, that the Shechina should be within us. Here the Rebbe says it also has to be in such a way of excelling in Torah, excelling in Tefillah, excelling in Tzedakah. Particularly, I spoke again regarding children. This applies to adults as well as to children. But regarding children, the Rebbe is asking that every child has its own siddur, every child has its own sefer, preferably a chumash, and every child has its own tzedakah pushka. Most advisable that the child's name should be on each one of their things. Tzedakah pushka should have the child's name, the chumash, as well as the siddur. And before we write a name, we know it's a Jewish custom to write Lashem Ha'aretz U'Malaya, that everything belongs to the Rebishter. To write Lashem Ha'aretz U'Malaya, and then write the name of the particular child who owns this Chumash or Siddur. Chumash and Siddur and Pushkin. The Rebbe says this is something which does not have only to do with Lubavitch. This is something which for all groups, for all people, he's requesting, and he's asking of us to spread this idea and to use our influence wherever possible to see to it that children have these things. In fact, the Rebbe spoke regarding teachers, counselors. The Rebbe says this is a message which he's asking all teachers, from kindergarten teachers to teachers who are teaching high-level grades, all relate this message to children. And he said that has a meaning to a child when somebody comes in to collect the pushke, and the child sees that his pushke is not empty, but the child also has from his money, which he put into the pushke during a period of time, and then the child is given a receipt for his donation, and this is creating within the child a tremendous warmth, a tremendous inspiration for the giving of tzedakah. And this is something which is extremely vital, extremely important in the education, the chinuch of the children. The Rebbe asked very, very strong. He kept on expressing himself. It's his bakosha kfula. It's a double request, and repeated this request a few times this afternoon in the Farbrengen, asking everyone to see to fulfill this inyan, cipher adults, cipher children, and reaching out wherever they only can have an influence to see that these inyanim are fulfilled. And the Rebbe says we have seen in the past that those who have put an effort into these inyanim were successful, that they did influence others, and they were very successful, in fact. Memela, the Rebbe says, he's sure that those from now and after will also be involved in reaching out to see to it that people as well as children should prepare their homes to be suitable for the V'shachanti b'seicham. V'asu l'mikdash v'shachanti b'seicham should be ready for a house for the Shechina. How is that done? By excelling in Torah, Tefillah, and Tzedakah. They will definitely succeed, and they will be extremely successful in this endeavor by trying to reach out to as many people to fulfill these inyanim. It's customary in the Farbrengens that the Rebbe Zolgesund discusses a Rashi regarding the Sedra. In today's Farbrengen, the Rebbe raised 3 questions and 3 different Rashis. First, the Rebbe raised a question in a Rashi at the end of the Sedra, where the Pasuk uses the expression Ba'agonois, that the blood was put, that is in Kapitel Chav Dalet, Pasuk Vav. Vayikach Moshe has taken Chatzi Adam, half of the blood, Vayosam Ba'agonois. Agonois is a new word. We never had this word in Chumash until now. What does it mean? Rashi doesn't tell us anything. All Rashi tells us that there were 2. Obviously it's a vessel, it's a dish. But why shouldn't Rashi tell us what type of a dish it was? And Rashi doesn't say anything. And this is strange, because Rashi's inyan is that whenever there is something, a new word in Chumash, Rashi should explain it. And here Rashi does. And interesting that other commentaries on Torah do explain it. And primarily Even Ezra. Even Ezra tells us that this is an Arabic explanation, and it's a description of a certain type of a dish. A dish, if I remember correctly, when it's narrow, is called agonis. Rashi doesn't mention anything. Why? Okay. Kelim agulim, they are round dishes. And he quotes a pasuk, Agan HaSahar, which is a pasuk in Shir HaShirim. And there he goes after, Ubaloshn Arabi, and in Arabic it means Agan. A round dish in Arabic is called Agan. Rashi doesn't tell us anything. Why? Rebbe says, perhaps we could learn that Even Ezra lived in the Arabic countries. And that is why he found a similar expression, how it was used in Arabic, and it's similar to the pasuk, so he brought it to our attention. Rashi lived in France or other neighboring countries, and that is why Rashi did not get involved in explaining this word. But again, the Rebbe was not satisfied with this interpretation, and he says, let us turn to Shir HaShirim, where the pasuk Agan HaSahar is mentioned. If we will look to Shir HaShirim, where Agan HaSahar is mentioned, there Rashi does explain it. And we know Rashi's custom is that whenever a word is mentioned the first time, that is when Rashi explains it. Rebbe mentioned, while talking about this Inyan, Rashi was not in the Arabic countries, the Islam countries. However, Rashi lived in France, but for a certain period of his life, Rashi wandered in exile. And based on that, in Gemara, where we also have a commentary on Rashi, Tosfos, when Tosfos refers to Rashi, Tosfos many times does not refer to him as Rashi, but refers to him as Hakuntaras. Kuntaras means a pamphlet. Why does it refer to him as a pamphlet? Why not as Rashi? Because Rashi wandered and went from city to city and left his Perush there and left it in the form of pamphlets, and it was not identified who it was from. Until later it was identified that this is from Rashi. He's just mentioned while talking about Rashi. The Rebbe is learning that here when we're learning agonos, the blood was put by agonos. So the child, it's not important to the child learning Chumash whether it is a round dish or a square dish or a narrow dish. And it's self-understood that agonos means a dish, because if you put blood into it, you put it into a dish. So that's why Rashi does not comment anything. Even Ezra does, Rashi does. Furthermore, in Shir HaShirim, when the pasuk Agan HaSahar is mentioned, there is a need for Rashi to explain what Agan HaSahar means. So Rashi explains it, however here he does. Another inyan in this week's Chazarah is where the pasuk says, when the Rebbe told Moshe he should go up to the mountain. So the Rebbe is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, is telling him, it's later in Kapitel Chav Dalet Pasuk Yud Beis. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, the Rebbe is telling Moshe,
Alei Elai Hahara, go up to the mountain. Vehayesham, and be there. So the Rebbe also raised the question. Rashi is quoting the words Alei Elai Hahara Vehayesham, and be there. For how long should he be there? Mem Yoim, 40 days. Why is Rashi getting involved in explaining this? And furthermore, we know that not only is the commentary of Rashi accurate, but the words of the pasuk which are quoted by Rashi are also accurate. Rashi is quoting many words. Alei Elai Hahara. The Rebbe is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, come up to me on the mountain, and Vehayesham, and stay there. Rashi, it would have been sufficient for Rashi just to quote Vehayesham, stay there. Stay there for how long? Mem Yain, for 40 days. Not enough. Another question. Obviously, the Rebbe is learning, Rashi is referring to the end of the Sedra. It tells us at the end, Vayovei Moshe b'seicha ana vayala laha, Vahi Moshe b'ha, how long was Moshe on the mountain? Arboim yom v'arboim loyla. So Rashi is like quoting the words from the pasuk, and is giving us the pasuk, bringing the pasuk a few psukim further to tell us for how long did Moshe go up to the mountain. So that's why it's important for Rashi to quote Alei Elai Hahara Vehayesham, because this is relating Moshe going up to the mountain. Vehayesham, and be there. For how long should he be there? Mem Yoim, 40 days. Moshe was there, the pasuk tells us, not only for 40 days, but for 40 nights. Arboim Yom v'arboim Laila. Rabbi says this is no question. Why? Because usually pasuk taka is very specific. But usually we know when in Hebrew, when we use the word Yoim, Yoim can apply to a 24-hour cycle as well. Yoim can apply to a Yoim v'Laila. So Rashi here is like wants to give us to understand the complete concept of Moshe's going up to Har Sinai. So that is why it's important for him to quote Alei Elai Hahara Vehayesham, and he's also mentioning for how long did he go? For Mem Yaim, for 40 days. Though the pasuk first tells it to us a few psukim later, but Rashi is mentioning it here, we should right away have a clear picture of what's going on. A third Rashi was raised by the Rebbe in today's Sedre. We have in today's Sedre, in Kesef Tal Ve'asami, if you will give a loan to somebody. Then we also have the expression, in Mizbach Adom Otase, if you will make a Mizbach Adom. So Rashi, in each one of them, quotes a saying of Rabbi Shmuel, that normally whenever there's an expression im in the Torah, im in Hebrew means if. If means reshus. It is up to you. It may happen, it may not happen. If it will happen, if you will come into such a situation and it will happen so and so, this is how you shall act. Then Rabbi Shmuel says, chutz megimel, besides three of the places. Interesting, as we just mentioned, Rashi's inyan is usually to mention something the first time it happens. This thought of Rabbi Shmuel, that always whenever it says in the Torah im, it means reshus, if it will happen. Besides, in these three places, Rashi mentions it at each one of the three places. Wow. Rashi really could have mentioned it only once, and we will know it for all the other three times. So we see, must be a reason in Rashi that each of the three times where the im is not if, but it means when it will happen, not if it will happen, but when it will happen, Rashi finds it important to quote this quotation of Rabbi Shmuel. So the Rebbe is learning very simple. Why? Because it's a very strong question. We know when a Rebbe learns with children and they come across a very strong question, the Rebbe usually makes it his business to explain the answer very well to the child, that the student should understand the answer very well. Same the Rebbe says, we learn im kesef tal ve'asami, if you will give a loan. What kind of if? We know we're obligated to help a Yid and give him a loan. So that is why Rashi has to tell you, the im here does not mean if, it means when you will give the loan. The same thing when the pasuk says, im mizbach adom atasali, if you will make a mizbeach. It's not an if. We know the Rebbe wants us to bring korbanos and make mizbeachas. Why if? So the child is puzzled. Why does the pasuk here use the expression im if? It's not an if. It's a definite thing. Obviously that will come to make a mizbeach. So that is why each of the three times, and also in the third place, in the Torah. That's why each of the 3 times, wherever it is an im, which is not meant if, but it means when it will happen, Rashi finds it important to mention it again, because the child who is learning the Chumash is like puzzled, why does the Torah use the expression if? Im, which means if normally. So Rashi tells us, you should know there's a saying that Rabbi Shmuel, that all over wherever it says im, it means if. Besides, in these 3 exceptions, where taka does not mean im, does not mean if, but it means when you will do so and so, these will be the details. Agutavach.
Tomorrow night, there will be in this shul here, tomorrow night, 8:30, there will be a siyum, a Masechta Kiddushin, which my father Alav Shalom began learning in this shul a little more than a year ago, and during the year the Masechta was completed, and the siyum was left for his first Yortzeit, which is tomorrow night. And tomorrow at 8:30 there will be a siyum and a suda, and everybody is invited to participate.